So this idea is something that typically we hear all the time within our business. We want to practice what's called the layered security, or this thing that's called the defense in depth approach. And for those of you that are new to this community, to this common body of knowledge, typically the metaphor that people will use is security is like an onion, where you put these dendritic-like protection rings around whatever is the most valuable thing in the center. And basically, you know, if you were to cut it in half, you would see at the core, typically for information security, in our world right now, usually right at the core is data. That is one of the most valuable, if not the most valuable thing to organizations. Now, what type of data and how you protect it and what all controls that you put to that is entirely up to you, but it depends on how much money you have. And oftentimes what we see is that the most expensive mechanisms are typically very close to the core. And so, near the middle here would be the most expensive, as close to the data as you can possibly get. And then as you spatially diffuse to the further rings out near the periphery, typically it would be less money as you move out to implement those controls to the out to the further away from the data. Now we could probably argue about or debate about labor, and certainly that's something to think of. But when we're practicing this defense in depth approach, it's important for us to understand that there is a layered model. And because of that, we can take the data and try to objectively figure out what is it doing and what do we need to do to make it as abstract as possible to put the CIA controls around to be able to classify those objects. We can hide data and make it not viewable. Typically, you sometimes jokingly hear people say security through obscurity. Anybody ever heard that before? And I think the naive approach is that the bad guys are stupid. And I think, after hearing some of your background with the 20 of you, you probably know by now, at this part in your career, that the bad guys they got the tools, they got the education, they have the training, just like we do. And oftentimes they compete with the best in the world. Sometimes they're even the best in the world. And so by you practicing security through obscurity, it's very likely that you got to pay the piper sooner or later with that. So just be careful. And then, as we're going through and trying to get these rings in this defense in depth approach, there is different mechanisms that we utilize when the data is at rest and when the data is in transit. And we've done some things with the -2, the FIPS 140-2 for some communication mechanisms for end-to-end encryption. I probably would put the FIPS 140 more in transit rather than full disk encryption, but I'm sure that it might be something that you could utilize for both. Transit could be TLS, IPsec, which we'll talk about later on in the week. But yeah, TLS, SSL, SSH is a big one too. Basically putting a protective sheath around whatever end-to-end transactional data in transit is super important if you want to keep it private. So those protection mechanisms really come in handy whenever we're talking about the defense in depth approach. And so typically this is the way that you see this drawn out in a meaningful way. Is the data is at the core, the users are near to the data, then you have some sort of application, endpoints, network, and then perimeter security as you spatially diffuse and move further away from the what you're trying to protect. And because of that, it really can be quite expensive depending on how much money you have within your organization to invest in these defense in-depth